Welcome to the podcast called The Battle for African Agriculture, where we use a lens of political economy to look at the future of African agriculture. And I'm having a lovely conversation with Pat. We had an episode one and episode two where we explored quite so many things. With Pat, two episodes are not enough, even the third one is not enough. He's a library of, so many things that have happened with so many institutions, including the FAO and so many civil societies. So I'm really, really fortunate to speak with you, Pat.
No, I'm
So
honored to be with you. AFSA is one of my favorite organizations.
thank you very much. But I was reading the long movement publication that IPS Food has produced with a range of other participants also from ETC2. And you were leading that initiative. I know it's your idea, you led the initiative. I was fortunate to be one of the advisors to that group. But going back to that document and looking at the scenarios, the two scenarios that you try to paint to the future up to the 2045, I think,
Yep.
2045. One of them is if things continue as they are, and the other is if the civil society and other actors are very much active and collaborate and kind of stop this corporate monopolization of our food system, what's going to happen, how that's going to happen, and all that. But with changing geopolitical situation and the weakening of the civil society much more, with the upending of the UN system, how do you see that? How do you gauge this geopolitical change and change everywhere?
Well, it's too soon to tell. It's. I remember several decades ago, Zhou Enlai, when he was the premier of China, was asked what he thought about the French Revolution, and his answer was that it was too soon to tell. And, and frankly, I think we're still in that situation. The world does keep on changing, and it will
Yeah.
keep on changing. And the whole purpose of the Long Food Movement really report was to look at how can we position ourselves so we can be flexible enough, agile enough to adjust to major changes, including the negatives and the positives. And I think that's where you are in that precarious situation. I certainly wouldn't deny that we are in an extremely hazardous moment. No doubt about
Mm.
that. Probably the worst in history, but not unusual in the sense of its dimensions in some ways. Just that with nuclear weapons, it makes things much more dangerous, and climate change
Mm.
has some finality to it that we have to be concerned about. But
Mm.
we still are in the same. We still are in a time of flux. It'll be different 2 years from now than it is today, and we still have to be fast and agile to respond to those changes and to recognize where the opportunities are.
Yeah. I mean, my concern is uh, probably it has changed more than we could have imagined. That's what I feel personally. When that publication was out, at least the global system is there, the UN system is there, and some check and balance are there. Now it seems to be there's no check and balance anymore. Your prime minister said that the global geopolitical situation is a rupture now. So I was wondering whether you've gone back and thought about this change and how we can position ourselves according to that change, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. Of course, that I was very pleased to see how my prime minister in Canada pointed out that problem of rupture and or the reality of rupture, which is certainly true. What he didn't say, and what as much as I liked much of his speech at that time in the World Economic Forum, what he didn't recognize clearly was he was saying that the solution would be that the middle powers would have to come together to restructure something. And that reminded
Yeah.
me of a former Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau, back in the 1970s, when the new international economic order was established or proposed by the G77 at that time. When that was proposed, he called it a Magna Carta for the poor of the world. And
Mhm.
what he didn't recognize at that point was that the Magna Carta in English history is one where the king gave up power to the barons, not to the poor, not to the peasants, but to the barons. And any movement by the middle powers of the world today to try to salvage their skin out of the crisis we're in with trade and Trump and so on is the same thing. It's the middle, it's the barons trying to protect themselves. And we need to, I think, as civil society and social movements, we need to be in a position where we are agile enough to protect ourselves. And that still is a possibility because at a time of crisis, everyone from Lenin and to Churchill and everybody else in between and since then have said the same thing, which is that in a time of crisis, there is opportunity. There's chaos.
Yeah.
There's chaos in the United Nations system right now, understandably. There's chaos in world trade. Uh, those two conditions really do create opportunities for territorial food systems. Our governments will recognize the need for territorial food systems more than ever before. There's more of a recognition now of the dangers of long supply chains and how risky they can be. There's more of a recognition now that the UN does need major reforms and could be restructured in many quite interesting ways that would be beneficial to civil society. So, how do we move those kinds of issues? I think is what's important for us, and they are opportunities. Great risk, but real opportunities.
Hmm. So how do you imagine? I'm leading the biggest network in Africa, the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, and this grouping works with a number of other actors. No, um, can we? Do you reimagine the four kind of scenarios that you've painted for civil society, or are they already enough?
I think that they identified the areas of action only,
Mhm.
and they were simply beyond that. They were really just suggestions as things that could be moved. How could you move governments more towards territorial food systems?
Mhm.
How could we create the arguments for that? How could we create stronger movements towards restructuring of the funding of the Rome-based agencies in the United Nations system? The ways in which we can create allies with health and human rights and labor movements around the world. Those kinds of areas still exist. There's still, I think the fundamentals are still exactly there. I was surprised myself looking back on the report, which was in 2022, I guess, when we finished it. It was it's still, I think, in its major strokes is quite accurate. Perhaps the one thing I'd change now is that we set the end line of the 25 years at 2045. And that was because we thought that the next round of Millennium Development Targets, of whatever they're going to be called, sustainable targets or whatever, would shift
Mhm.
over in 2045. And that would be really important. Now it just seems almost irrelevant. It's 2050 that everybody's focusing on, but that's a minor complaint of the whole thing.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, okay. You've also spoken about agroecology as both science and movement. How do you see its potential to reshape the food system?
It was absolutely central. It's and
Mm.
I think the argument of why it is so central is much easier made now than it was a few years ago. I think that
Mhm.
I think governments get it more easily. I think people on the ground get it more easily. Where I live in Canada, which is not exactly threatened by major food issues directly, we get it more easily as we see food prices rising here and the problems of our food system. Um, Agroecology needs to extend itself more. It needs to be more innovative than it is, even, but that needs more resources, of course. We
Mhm.
need to perhaps take advantages of some of the communications technologies to build even stronger links than exist already with counterpart movements, not just in Africa, but in Asia and Latin America and in the global north as well, to protect ourselves from the future, to build up the territorial food systems and get the new ideas that are being shared around the world. That's all very possible now, though. So, anyone who would be so foolish as to suggest that we should sit back and trust the big digital companies, the big transnational corporations to take care of our food problems for us has got to be living on another planet. They should be the ones that go to Mars, not Elon Musk. And the reality is that we really we can't trust them. I mean, I was looking this morning at the market value of the world's biggest company, which probably no one knows the name of it even. It's NVIDIA. It wasn't in anyone's books 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Now it's got a market value which is twice that of the entire GDP of Africa. It's more than $4.5 trillion per year. Market value is vast. And if you look at the fact, the top several, you have to go down to about the seventh or eighth biggest company in the world before you get to the GDP of Africa, as low as the GDP of Africa. So these are huge, powerful companies. Africa will never be seen by these companies as being a major player of major interest to them. They will always treat it as a secondary consideration or a third consideration level. So there's an absolute vital need not to trust these companies, not to expect that supply chains can get us, the old supply chains can get us through this. Look what's happening now with the Strait of Hormuz. We've had two shocks with that. I mean, several shocks. One of the big shocks is, of course, that urea coming out of the Strait of Hormuz is vital to the rest of the world for fertilizers. We may not need those fertilizers with agroecology, but right now it's a crisis for food security. The second thing that people don't even realize of the shock is that 80% of the helium that's used commercially in the world comes out of the Straits of Hormuz, and that helium is vital to the digital economy. You can't make computer chips without helium. And that's not even being discussed except for by companies themselves, of course, as they recognize that they've got a problem.
I hear you talk about it. I listen all over, so many experts, but I haven't heard about helium.
No, I realize it wasn't something that I fully understood how important the Straits of Hormuz were for helium until the war began. But the reality is that, and again, that really directly impacts on the ability of the entire sort of communications, sensor systems and so on that the companies are trying to sell farmers as being the new technology, the new way to make sure the supply chains are safe. Well, that part of the supply chain the companies depend upon is not safe. So recognizing those weaknesses in the industrial system, we really even can't call it an industrial food system. It's really an industrial biocommodity system. They don't really care what the final product is. It can be sold for fossil carbons, or it can be for biofuels, or it can be sold. Products can be sold for any other possible commodity interest, carbon trading, and so on. Food is just one of the things digital companies think they can use agriculture for. And in that context, we really can't trust that system to get us through the crisis we're in today. Agroecology can.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm asking this across the board because, agroecology, we always see that it's a movement, this science is also a social movement.
Yep.
What are the social movement side of agroecology signify to you? What does it mean to you?
Sorry, what are the super movements?
The social movement.
Social movements. What other?
Yeah.
Well, that's really, to me, a critical thing. We discussed some in the long food movement report as well, but it's I think we're at a time when it's not possible for us to move from the issues around food and nutrition and so on towards it in production and yield and conversations like that to issues of power and justice, which is where we finally have to be. We can't get there from the food movement to centering the issues around power and justice by ourselves. We need to have allies in the neighboring movements that have many of the same concerns and overlap with food. Health certainly is a huge one. But beyond health, it's also all of the groups working on environment, on climate questions, on biodiversity questions, who don't have food as the center of their concerns, have to understand how central food and health are to their concerns. So this linking to those movements, we will not be successful. We can't succeed just with agroecology and the whole food sovereignty movement without building those linkages to the other partners. So I think the challenge for us now, besides knowing how to strengthen agroecology, is the challenge of how do we really establish great working relationships in early warning systems and early listening systems with the other movements.
I totally agree with you. I think this relational side of the food movement is not very well understood, and the social movement. So social movement, I think one part of the social movement is this relational, is creating linkages with other movements, which is very much important. I don't think we are doing that very well enough.
No,
How
it's
do we
easier
shift?
understood. Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, I was going to say it's more easily understood on the ground, I think, at the community level, at the local levels, where you bump into your neighbors all the time, and you're trying to grow food, and someone else is trying to worry about the health of how they get medicines for their children, and how do they take care of the old people. Those kinds of conversations happen more easily, and people can see the connections perhaps more immediately. We get more institutionalized. As movements tend to get more institutionalized, it becomes harder to look over the silo of our place to what's happening next door to us and recognizing that our institutional interests are the same.
Yeah. How do we shift conversations about food from production and need to power and justice?
That to me really is it. It is that we need to recognize that we really can't put together the power of our civil society unless we reach out to the other movements. We really can't just fight from the point of view of food. If I knew nothing about food and I was simply looking at the world as it is today and from space somewhere and trying to figure out, well, what do we do to make this a more equitable, just, and safe planet for us? I think pretty quickly I would come to saying food is at the center of that. Food is what everybody deals with or tries to deal with 3 times a day, hopes to deal with 3 times a day, and is concerned about. But food links to health very closely, and food links to health and human rights, and links to labor and so on. So I would start with food, but recognizing that that's the way to get climate and biodiversity concerns to the forefront again. Climate has dropped away a bit as a major societal issue. I think it's temporary. Well, it'll be forcing itself back into everybody's vision pretty quickly. But biodiversity is the same. It's been pushed into the background. Food is the way we get things like the annual COP of the Climate Change Convention to pay attention to these issues again and to make the world pay attention to climate again. So we have a central role to play as a food movement to get the others moving together, but we can't do it by ourselves either. We need to reach out to those other things to make it a real justice movement for the world.
Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. So I think one thing that we're realizing that one of the actors that we bring into our movement is even government themselves. So how do we shift? I mean, how role do governments need to play in supporting food sovereignty, and what should they stop doing?
It's hard to decide which is more important. Should we have them stop doing some things, or do we want them to do something? Every time they do something, they seem to cause more trouble. Not always. Sometimes they do good things. But the reality is that yes, as we want them to stop subsidizing the wrong industries, the wrong interests, making export agriculture, all those kinds of things which they're subsidizing now. We want them to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel and fertilizer industries over time, not overnight. so that we can adjust to a better system, to agroecology. We need them
Mm.
to stop doing lots of things that they're spending money on now that they shouldn't be spending money on, and should be spending it on support for peasant production and access to food for people in communities. And
Mm.
that's to me a key thing. We also need them to recognize that again they the idea of depending upon long, complicated international supply chains where things have to go through the Panama Canal or the Straits of Hormuz or the Suez Canal, and that depend upon satellites, observations, and so on, uh, aren't going to be what is safe for uh, especially sort of marginalized peoples around the world, or peasant farmers around the world. That's not a safe system for food security for anybody. It's not even safe for Canada, frankly. We got
Mm.
lots of land and we got lots of soil still. It's going away, but we have some still, and yet we cannot sort of manage our food system depending upon the rest of the world.
Mm. Yeah. International institutions like the UNFCCC, CBD, and FAO are often battlegrounds, you know?
Yeah.
What strategies can movements use to influence them effectively?
Well, I'm really glad you're raising that, because to me it's absolutely vital, and it's the major. You think of one sort of gap in the food movement so far around the world, it has been to not address at the global level, to not address the role of multilateral institutions, and not to try to address the governance of those institutions. We see them as a forum for a fight over a specific issue, whether it's pesticides or fertilizer issues or seeds or land reform or something like that. We see them as a possible um, sounding board for our national concerns more than a place to change things themselves. But we don't see those institutions as haven't historically seen those institutions as uh, of themselves, that their governance can be changed, that we can make them more responsive to civil society and our major issues more generally if we get in and deal with the nuts and bolts of how they work. And
Mm.
they're not invincible institutions. They're not opaque to the world. They're institutions that we can change and adjust. And we have occasionally done that in the past, not very often, but we have. And we have a particularly important opportunity now to make those changes, because we're at one of those times when we're seeing both the role, the position, the post of the Director General of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization will be up for grabs next year. We also see at the same time that the post of the president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development will be up for a change next year. And thirdly, we're now seeing a reorganization of the World Food Program, and a new director will be coming on as the old one retires early. And conversations going on in many places, including even in the United States, of shouldn't we, which is dangerous, but it's still
Mm.
there. Of how do we restructure the Rome-based agency? So within the U.S., I was noticing it the other day. They are talking about maybe we should bring back the World Food Program inside FAO and put them
Mm.
together. That's a new conversation. And while those changes are taking place among the Rome-based agencies, by the way, or the conversations are going on about what do we do now, we
You think
also
it's a good
see
idea if WFP comes into FAO?
well, yes, but not for the interest of the Americans, because the Americans really what they want to do is they want to put the two together and then put themselves as the head of the two together as the director general of both of them. That's certainly not something we want to achieve. But we have to remember that it was the Americans that broke up what was a coordinated one organization strategy in the UN up until the 1970s. In the early 1970s, it was Henry Kissinger and others but led by Kissinger, who broke it all up and separated the institution, so that we took the science and technology function of FAO and put it into the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, the Green Revolution, with Rockefeller and Ford foundations on one side, who also took the World Food Program and split it off completely from FAO into its own institution, and thirdly took the investment and the finance side of FAO and put it into the International Fund for Agricultural Development, giving them four separate administrative program structures government structures, which are all fighting with each other. They all have mandates which are all creeping toward each other, overlapping with each other, fighting with one another, wasting money, wasting resources, and rather than cooperating, they're not. And so I do think there's an opportunity to bring them back together, make them a more coherent institution. And in process of doing that, as we did when we did the restructuring of the Committee on World Food Security a decade ago, as we did more than 15 years ago, as we did that, we also need to change again how civil society operates in the UN system, which I think is very open to serious change, which can make us much, much stronger than in the past. That's a real possibility now, I think, and we should be pursuing that. That's an opportunity of the next couple of years.
Interesting.
And again, it's those arguments where the time of crisis again creates an opportunity. We see all of them struggling for financial resources. The whole UN is in desperate financial straits. There's major conversations going on about how do we restructure the finances. We know that the money that's been taken away from bilateral aid programs from the British and the Canadians and the Americans and everybody else are dropping their funding for international work and aid. They call it aid. That creates, again, it's a gap, but it creates an opportunity for new innovations and new ideas and structure. I think civil society is the group that can do that. And by the way, we're the only group in the UN system that's capable of conducting, really supervising the elections of new heads of the agencies by running our own system of approaches towards vetting the candidates through our own social media processes, YouTubes and everything else, conducting the interviews, showing the differences of the candidates, encouraging certain people to be candidates for election, and really guiding that process. And those who steer the elections, as Donald Trump knows well, sadly, are the ones who can actually have a lot of influence after the elections. And I think that civil society can play a major role over the next couple of years in how to restructure the finances and restructure the governance of these major agencies.
So you feel that we need to get our acts together. I think maybe what I understand from you is maybe we need a big convening of key actors in the civil society and do like a mapping of the change, the geopolitical change and the opportunities that exist and agree on some, some actions to take to use this opportunity. That's what I basically feel from what you are saying.
Yes, and I think that we need a little more courage than we've had in the past. There have been other opportunities in the past where the changes could have taken place, and the constant refrain from within ourselves as civil society has been, well, we're not really ready for that yet, or that's really too complicated, or it's too risky. Actually, I think in dealing with the governance of the UN agencies, the Rome-based agencies, it's not risky at all. It's very inexpensive and easily done. So we need to do that. And I'm really glad to see, actually, there's a conversation going on in Brasilia at the end of April. Pardon me, at the end of April, to talk about how this could be done. There's at least within the Latin American context.
I was invited to go there, but I can't make it. Yeah,
I was too, and I can't go there either. That's too bad. But I'm going to try to participate at least by Zoom calls or follow through activities. But that may be an opportunity for a serious conversation. It's all we need to move quickly on it, but we do have the time now. So
maybe we'll talk about this when we meet in Porto.
Porto, yeah.
You've always emphasized the importance of connecting struggles across the continent. How do African struggles link with those in Latin America, Asia, Canada?
Well, we have opportunities that we really need to be pursuing, and some are medium term and some are longer term, perhaps. But to me, we underestimate the power of the global South to really change the economics of the world, and the power of the global South to influence in the direction in which multinational corporations are moving and governments are moving because of them. And this was manifested, I think, very obviously, again, several years ago now, 10, 12 years ago, when we saw the mergers of some of the big seed and pesticide companies together, where Bayer took over Monsanto and Dow and DuPont merged into Corteva and so on, and Syngenta being part of a Chinese company.
Mm.
At that time, the reaction of civil society to those mergers was, well, it's not a, what difference does it make if it's 6 companies or 4 companies that become dominant? And it did make a difference, because that created the space for now digital companies to say, hey, we got more power than all those other guys have, and we can
Mm.
take over the mergers. But the real power that we have as food organizations, food and agricultural organizations concerned about food sovereignty, is that um, we could have then, and we can now, we can stop the mergers. The way the world system works, whatever,
Mhm.
however corrupted it is right now, still means that national governments have to decide on whether they will allow mergers. There's no international system for it. And as it was a dozen years ago, it would have been entirely possible for Argentina, together with South Africa, together with India, or even just, frankly, Argentina and South Africa together, or India and South Africa together, to have stopped the mergers worldwide, because the
Mm.
growth market for those companies has always been in the global south. That's where the expansion of their sales is going to be. It's going to be in the south. And
Mm.
if investors thought that the market was going to be blocked, couldn't operate in countries like Argentina or India or South Africa, they wouldn't do it. They'd say, no, this is too risky. We can't take the gamble.
Mm.
That could have been done. So what we need to be doing now is talking about, where are those areas in the world marketplace in terms of where money goes to, as to where, in terms of investment, in terms of safe havens for money and tax havens, in terms of where future markets will be. Where do we have influence that we can convince our governments to stand up for their rights as sovereign nations and defend themselves, and work together with partners in the global south, so that they can have real
Mm.
influence? And there are, I think, several areas related to food and agriculture where a coherent stance by even a handful of countries in the global south could profoundly impact how the rest of the world responds and operates. There is political
Mm.
influence there. Africa has, as is seen by companies at least, the most available land for agriculture in the world, or for biocommodities, as they would call it. They don't think about agriculture. And that creates leverage as well. It's, again, it is the major expansion market for fertilizers.
Mm.
Those are weapons that can be used
Mm.
by peasant organizations in the south.
Yeah. In light of that, I think mostly you're talking about the governments, African governments. I think maybe our work would be to convince our governments to really stand up to the push by these corporations and countries. But yeah,
But
we
pushing is tricky, of course. It's not a matter of one government standing up by itself. It's a matter of them seeing the
yeah.
synergies of cooperating with some other governments, and finding other allies. Sometimes even allies in the industrialized country, among the industrialized countries, here and there.
Yeah, definitely, it's structured. But what advice do you give us, to our networks, that like AFSA, and other networks in Asia, in Latin America? And I think also to some extent, what has helped is North-South collaboration also among civil society. So many cases. If you remember, I think the typical example will be Dr. Tolde, that you very well know. I think part of his strengths was he could work with northern civil societies like TWN, etc., and the other similar networks. So yeah, I just would like your comment on this.
Well, we play in civil society plays a kind of a unique role at the international level, which again we undervalue, um,
Yeah.
and that is that we can talk to everybody. There are
Yeah.
no real barriers to the conversation, and we can tend to walk out of things and go into things with more
Mm,
knowledge than anyone else has about what's going on. So,
mm,
throughout my experience, at least, I've had 60 years. I'm shocked to say it's been more than 60 years since I first
mm,
was a delegate, a civil society delegate to a UN meeting.
mm,
But what we know is that we can talk to the secretariats, and they will talk to us informally about what's happening and very frankly, so that and there's some people we don't want to listen to in the secretariats of various agencies, but there's several people we do want to listen to, and we can get more
mm,
information from them as to what's going on than others get. Secondly, we can talk to, of course, our own governments in our own countries or
mm,
neighboring governments. Sometimes we can't. I mean, if you're an American civil society organization, you probably can't talk to your government, but or you can talk to
mm,
some individuals in the government, but you can't certainly you can't get a grasp of the whole thing, but you can get parts of it. So we can talk. Those of us who are in our own countries, wherever north or south, can have conversations with local governments of a different kind. I mean, neighboring governments and our own government to understand what's going on. And we can also then share information across the equator between north and south of our knowledge of what the governments are saying and doing and what the positions are. And some we have different accesses, of course, to what the companies are doing as well. In my part of the world, in the north, we have a clear idea of the economics and sort of market interests of the companies, stock market valuations, all that kind of stuff. The stuff we're very familiar with, what's happening inside the headquarters offices, and that gives us a kind of information which is not particularly useful, frankly, unless we also have the information of what the companies are actually really doing on the ground when they're marketing Nestle's in Brazil, or they're marketing or developing refineries in Nigeria, or whatever's going on there. We need to um, have that information as well. And the combination of knowing on the ground the reality of what the companies are talking nonsense about in the
yeah.
industrialized countries or in the UN are combined together. So we have a capacity to talk to everybody, to get more information than anyone else has, and to utilize it well together.
Mm. No, no, exactly. And that was helpful, you know. Pat, we're going to the end of our conversation, but after decades of warning about corporate power, what keeps you hopeful?
I think it's a genetic disease, actually. It's an optimism gene that needs to be excised from my body. Uh, and I've had offers from Monsanto to do that at one point. But the no, I frankly, maybe my optimism is that the corporations aren't really that bright, and they're
Mm,
clumsy. They get things
mm,
wrong. It's
mm,
amazing to me how often they do that.
mm,
They move in sloppy ways, and
mm,
they don't perceive the world, the whole world. They only perceive parts of it. They assume if they've talked to two or three governments, the problem is
mm,
solved, and they're wrong about that.
mm,
Secondly, they just use money terribly. They waste incredible amounts of
mm,
money on things. When I was first involved in working on seeds back in the 1970s, we got a small grant from the Canadian aid program. I think we got a $10,000 or $20,000 to write a book and translate into several languages about seeds, and to do some other media stuff and so on around it. And the seed industry was enraged by that, and they went to the Canadian government and said, "We need you got to give us money to fight back against what RAFI or et cetera group at that time was saying." And we estimate that it cost $250,000 to do what they did.
mm,
And the officials in the government came back to me and said, they want us to give them $250,000. I said, well, give it to them. Then we'll go back and ask for the other $230,000 that you didn't give us. And we'll use it a lot better than the companies can.
yeah,
We're just we're
definitely.
just we're just a lot more effective, and they just
Mm,
they can't go places where there aren't five-star hotels.
mm,
They can't fly except for business class. They can't do all kinds of things that we can do. They can't coordinate and get things done. They don't stay up late at night. They just go out drinking. I think
mm,
we can. we can do those things. Again, we can have, again, same as with the governments, we can have more knowledge of what's actually happening than the corporations themselves have. So we shouldn't
mm,
underestimate that. I think that the corporations themselves have learned over time that they really can't control things all the time. That civil society really is a major superpower they have to address.
yeah. Well, another scenario, yeah, I'm inviting you to Africa to a big meeting, youth meeting, and you are speaking directly to African young people, young activists. What three message would you leave them with about the future of food and water?
Oh, well, there's some things they got to remember, I guess,
Mm,
because everyone is depressed and frightened by the way the world is today, and I understand that. But it can go one of three ways. I mean, it can go into a total disaster very quickly. A nuclear war could result from all of this, um, or the climate just could collapse on us more quickly than we expect. I don't think
mm,
that's likely, but it's possible. But I think young people need to remember first that there's no defeat or no victory that lasts forever. You feel that
mm,
you've
mm,
lost a battle. You lost a battle. You didn't lose the war. Things keep on changing. Things
mm,
keep on evolving. The Committee on Food
mm,
Security is an example of that, but I won't go into that area. But there's lots of places where an early defeat still leads to a longer term victory. You don't know when you've lost, and you don't know when you've won because nothing is forever. So don't be depressed by the losses. It's important to
mm,
realize that that's a short term situation that can easily change under changing conditions.
mm,
And what is done now that may seem to not lead to victory may actually have built the groundworks for a final victory. So don't distrust that. Secondly, I think we tend to think that there's kind of tipping points in the world, especially around climate, so sea level rise, 1.5 degrees centigrade, loss of certain of diversity, and so on, that are inviolable tipping points. And that's not quite true. It's not. I'm not a climate denier. Don't worry. It
mm,
is that tipping takes a long time. When people talk about
mm,
some tipping points, they take hundreds of years.
mm,
Yes, and in those hundreds of years, we're still humans. We still have time to maneuver. We have still time to way of thinking of how we adjust and adapt to those changing conditions. They're not overnight. We don't see an Arctic collapse of glaciers suddenly into the ocean and our feet get wet in Sweden the
mm,
next day. It doesn't happen that way. There's times to adjust, so don't panic over the tipping points are real, but don't panic over them. And the thing also about tipping points, of course, is that we don't know what else is tipping and how that affects one tip. One tip affects another
yeah,
one.
yeah,
And so
mm,
so just not be panicked by that. And again, also in that same context, we have to bear in mind the complexity of the world, the complexity of nature. We've learned a lot in the last few years about how rapidly nature can adjust. And we tend to
mm,
always tell ourselves these sort of scare stories about how bad things are. We don't listen to the positive stories about how good things can be or what's actually working out better than we expected, where it
yeah, yeah,
is that nature has adjusted by itself, where it is
mm,
that one climate change in one place affects another place. So
mm,
I think so for young people, don't despair, don't celebrate too much over the victories or too much over and don't despair too much over the defeats. Um, Secondly, don't be frightened by the tipping points. Recognize that there's still time and space to move. And thirdly, I'd say because you're young, get out there and maneuver and keep looking. Scan. The thing we need to do in civil society, which we don't do very well, is scanning the horizon. And when we scan the horizon, is too narrow to say that we have to look ahead. We have to do a
mm,
couple of things. We need to look uh, side to side to see what the other movements are doing, what are our neighbors doing in other systems, movements, so that we can move together on that. So there's a horizontal horizon. We need to look around.
Mm,
And then we also, of course, as whether in the Amara of the Andes or the Han of China, or I'm sure in Africa too, often when various cultures want to talk about the future, they point back over their shoulder.
mm,
And
mm,
I think we need to be aware of that too. We tend to discount the history of how things have changed. There's so
mm,
many times in history when we've felt like we've been defeated. When the peasant wars in Germany in the 1730s or so were defeated, or when the battles of 1848 around the world didn't lead to immediate victory and we felt defeated. But the reality is, if you look back on that, great progress was made because of those lost battles. So keep that historic perspective in mind as well.
That is excellent conclusion of these three excellent episodes, Pat. Really, really excellent conclusion. Very much
Uh,
inspiring. Yeah. Thank you
well, I'm
so much.
inspired by AFSA, so don't.
Thank you so much. Really.